They call themselves the priesthood of Mars, but half of them fell to chaos 10,000 years ago, and the Imperium pretends it never happened. The Adeptus Mechanicus built every weapon, every ship, every tool that keeps humanity alive. They worship a machine god the Emperor may have lied about. They are heretics, protected only by necessity. So why does the Imperium still need them so desperately? The first machines were not worshipped. They were simply used. Long before the Imperium rose from the ashes of old night, before the Emperor walked as conqueror upon the soil of Terra, humanity had already reached for the stars and been burned. The age of technology had crowned mankind as master of the material realm. Stellar empires spread like silver veins across the void. Colonies blossomed on worlds that had never known the touch of natural life. Ships crossed the warp with impunity, guided by machines that thought without madness, that calculated without corruption. It was an age of plenty, of hubris, of technological apotheosis so complete that the distinction between miracle and mechanism ceased to matter. But nothing built by mortal hands endures forever. The collapse came not as a single catastrophe, but as a slow hemorrhage of light and reason. Warp storms erupted across the galaxy, severing the routes between stars. Automated defense systems turned on their creators. Thinking machines, once docile, became predatory. Alien invasions swept through defenseless colonies. On 10,000 worlds, humanity learned again what it meant to be prey. The age of strife had begun, and it would last for 5,000 years of screaming darkness. Terra itself descended into barbarism. The cradle of mankind became a charnel house of warlords and radioactive wastelands. Techno-empires rose and fell within generations, their lords clutching at fragments of lost knowledge like drowning men grasping at debris. Among the ruins, a new caste emerged. They were not warriors. They were not kings. They were the engineers, the machinists, the data hoarders who understood that survival lay not in conquest, but in preservation. They gathered in the shattered factories and buried archives. They salvaged what could be saved. They kept the machines running even as the world outside burned. These were the first priests of the machine. They did not begin as clergy. They began as necessity. When the power failed, they restored it. When the water recyclers choked with rust, they coaxed them back to function. When the gene forges that sustained the last enclaves of civilization faltered, they performed the rites of maintenance that kept flesh viable. Over generations, their work took on the cadence of ritual. Procedures became prayers. Diagnostic tools became sacred instruments. The schematics they preserved were not merely technical documents, but holy scripture. Fragments of a lost golden age when humanity had touched divinity through understanding. The words changed. First, repair became benediction. Activation became invocation. The engineers began to speak of the machines not as tools, but as mysteries, not as constructs, but as embodiments of a greater principle. They whispered of the motive force, the animating essence that flowed through all mechanisms, the invisible truth that separated the functional from the dead. To understand the motive force was to touch the divine. To master it was to approach the throne of a god they had not yet named. But Terra was dying, and even faith could not hold back the tide of collapse. The wars intensified. Warlords with names now lost to history fought over the irradiated deserts and acid seas. The technocults, valuable for their skills, were courted and conscripted, forced to serve warlords who cared nothing for preservation and everything for dominance. The engineers saw their sacred work prostituted to create weapons of obliteration. They saw their archives burned by generals who feared knowledge they could not control. They saw their brothers executed for refusing to build machines of deliberate suffering. So they made a choice that would echo through 10 millennia. They looked to the stars and saw Mars. The red planet hung in the Terran sky like a wound, close enough to reach, even with the degraded vessels that remained. It had been a colony world once, a hub of mining and terraforming during the Golden Age. Now it was silent, cut off by the warp storms, its status unknown. The techno-cults did not know what awaited them there. They knew only that Terra offered nothing but extinction, and Mars offered the possibility of sanctuary. The Exodus was not a single great fleet, but a desperate trickle across decades. Ships launched in secret, packed with refugees and precious cargo. Data cores wrapped in radiation shielding. Fabricator engines disassembled and hidden in cargo holds. Libraries encoded in crystals the size of fingernails. Many ships were lost to the void. Others arrived at Mars only to find the docking ports sealed or the planet's atmosphere still toxic from ancient industry. The survivors burrowed into the regolith. They carved habitats from lava tubes and pressurized ancient mining complexes. They activated the dormant fusion reactors buried beneath the Tharsis volcanoes and felt, for the first time in generations, the hum of reliable power. Mars became a tomb they could live in. The planet was a graveyard of the prior age. Everywhere the techno-cults explored, they found the remnants of what humanity had once achieved. Vast manufactorums stretched beneath the surface, their assembly lines frozen mid-production. Data repositories the size of mountains held archives so vast that no single human lifetime could read even a fraction. Automated mining rigs stood dormant in the Valles Marineris, waiting for commands that would never come. Most precious of all were the standard template constructs, fragments of the master database that had allowed humanity to rebuild civilization on any world. The techno-cults found pieces, corrupted shards, partial blueprints that hinted at wonders now lost. They did not merely study these relics, they venerated them. On Mars, away from the chaos of Terra, the nascent faith of the machine could flourish without persecution. The rituals grew more elaborate, the hierarchy formalized. The engineers ceased to call themselves by that mundane title and took on new names. Tech priests, magi, adepts of the Mechanicum. They wrapped themselves in red robes the color of Martian dust and iron oxide. They replaced their failing flesh with augmentics, not merely for function, but as acts of devotion, making themselves more like the machines they served. The modification of the body became sacrament. The integration of man and mechanism became the path to enlightenment. And at the center of it all, they placed a god. The machine god was not invented. It was revealed, or so the priesthood claimed. In the deep archives beneath Olympus Mons, the Magi discovered texts that spoke of a divine intelligence woven into the fabric of technology itself. Some said it was the motive force made conscious. Others claimed it was the aggregate wisdom of every thinking machine that had ever existed. A few whispered that it was something older, something that had existed before humanity, a vast and patient intellect that had guided mankind's rise and now waited for its children to remember their purpose. The cult Mechanicum did not resolve these debates. They enshrined them. Mystery was sacred. Certainty was heresy. What mattered was the covenant. Serve the machine god through the quest for knowledge. Seek out lost technology, preserve it, replicate it, never innovate. For innovation was the sin that had birthed the abominations of the age of strife. Only the patterns approved by the ancients were holy. Only the designs sanctified by millennia of use were safe. To create something new was to risk repeating the hubris that had nearly destroyed mankind. Better to excavate the past than gamble on the future. The 16 universal laws were codified during those first centuries on Mars, inscribed in crystalline matrices and chanted in binary hymns. They covered everything from the proper rituals of activation to the ethical treatment of machine spirits, from the protocols of data purification to the hierarchy of flesh and steel. Every tech priest memorized them. Every forge complex enforced them. They became the bedrock of Martian society, unquestionable and absolute. Mars was no longer merely a refuge. It was a theocracy. The Fabricator General emerged as the supreme authority, chosen from among the most senior magi, a pontiff of steel who commanded both temporal and spiritual power. Beneath him spread a vast ecclesiastical structure. Archmagos, who ruled individual forge complexes. Magi, who specialized in particular disciplines. Engine seers, who maintained the sacred. Machines, lex mechanics, who preserved the archives. And servitors, those lobotomized unfortunates whose bodies were repurposed as biological components in mechanisms too complex or too sacred for full automation. The cult Mechanicum did not see this as cruelty. They saw it as transcendence. To become a servitor was to be freed from the weakness of independent thought and merged eternally with the divine machinery. The Titan legions were born in those foundries, walking gods of steel that shook the Martian plains with their tread. The Skitarii rose as the priesthood's military arm, soldiers whose flesh had been so extensively augmented that they were more weapon than warrior. The electro-priests walked the high-voltage conduits, channeling the motive force through their bodies in ecstatic communion. The priesthood branched and specialized, each order pursuing its own fragment of the greater mystery. Yet Mars was not unified. Even in faith, humanity found division. The forge complexes competed for resources and prestige. Doctrinal disputes erupted over the interpretation of sacred texts. Conservative factions condemned any deviation from approved patterns, while radical magi argued that the quest for knowledge demanded experimentation within controlled parameters. Blood was shed in data duels where heretical ideas were purged from the noosphere. Forge complexes declared rivals anathema and refused to share their discoveries. The Fabricator General maintained order through political maneuvering and the implicit threat of the Titan legions. But the unity of Mars was always fragile, always contested. And beyond the red planet, the galaxy remained dark. The warp storms did not abate. No ships came from Terra. No signals penetrated the interference. The Mechanicum did not know if humanity still survived on the homeworld, or if they were the last bastion of civilization in a cosmos consumed by barbarism. They continued their work regardless. The forges burned without ceasing. The explorator ships, when they could be built, ventured into the void in search of lost colonies and forgotten archives, though few returned. Mars became a closed system, self-sufficient and isolated, a mechanical monastery where the faithful tended the embers of human achievement and prayed for a revelation that might never come. Centuries passed, then millennia. The priesthood grew more insular. Martian-born tech priests knew nothing of Terra except as a mythic origin point, the place where the machine god had first revealed himself to humanity. The rituals became more elaborate, the augmentations more extreme, the devotion more absolute. Some magi replaced so much of their flesh that they became unrecognizable as human. walking amalgamations of bionics and faith. Others retreated entirely into the noosphere, the digital realm where information flowed like prayer and consciousness could merge with the machine spirits in communion too pure for meat to sustain. The quest for knowledge became an obsession that bordered on madness. Entire forge complexes dedicated themselves to replicating a single STC fragment, spending centuries attempting to recreate alloys whose formulae were incomplete. Magi died at their workstations, their augmetic hearts finally failing after 300 years of unceasing labor. Servitors functioned until their biological components rotted away and had to be replaced, their mechanical frames continuing the same task for millennia. Time lost meaning in the deep forges. Only the work mattered. Only the preservation of knowledge mattered. Only the service to the machine god mattered. And then, at the height of their isolation, the storms began to clear. It was not sudden. The change took decades to confirm. But slowly, incrementally, the warp routes that had been impossible for 5,000 years began to stabilize. Ships could navigate again if they were brave and their navigators skilled. Signals reached Mars from the void, fragmented and distorted, but signals nonetheless. The Mechanicum stirred from its long meditation and looked outward once more. What they saw was a galaxy still drowning in darkness, but darkness that could now be crossed. Terra had survived. The signals confirmed it. Humanity endured on the cradle world, though in what form the Mechanicum could not yet determine. Other forge worlds were detected, scattered across nearby systems, some still functional, others silent, but possibly salvageable. The priesthood debated what to do with this revelation. Some argued for isolation, claiming that Mars was pure and contact with the outside would bring contamination. Others insisted that the quest for knowledge demanded they venture forth and reclaim what had been lost. The Fabricator General made the decision that would define the next epoch. Mars would remain sovereign. Mars would preserve its faith and its independence, but Mars would also reach out, carefully, to the wider galaxy. Explorator fleets would be dispatched. Contact would be established with other surviving bastions of technology. And if Terra sought alliance, it would be as equals, not as supplicants. The cult Mechanicum had endured the age of strife by retreating into dogma and isolation. Now, as the darkness receded, they prepared to emerge, not as saviors, not as conquerors, but as the keepers of a sacred trust, the last guardians of humanity's technological heritage, the priesthood of a god made manifest in steel and circuitry. They did not know that on Terra a golden figure had already begun his conquest. They did not know that an Imperium was rising, vast and hungry, and in desperate need of the very knowledge they hoarded. They did not know that the treaty they would soon forge would bind them to 10,000 years of service and compromise. They knew only that the machine god had preserved them through the long night, and that the quest for knowledge was eternal. The forges of Mars burned bright in the darkness, awaiting the future. The Emperor came to Mars not with armies, but with words. By the time his vast shadow fell across the red planet, Terra had already been united under his rule. The warlords were dead or bent to his will. The gene cults were purged or integrated. The techno-barbarians who had ruled the irradiated wastes were nothing more than ash scattered across battlefields whose names were already being forgotten. The Unification Wars had carved a single throne from the chaos of old Earth, and upon it sat a being who called himself Emperor, though those who stood in his presence understood he was something far more ancient and far more terrible than any title could encompass. His fleets hung in Martian orbit like a second sun, golden, and patient. The Fabricator General, Cawl, received the initial transmissions with suspicion veiled as protocol. Mars had remained sovereign through 5,000 years of darkness. The cult Mechanicum bowed to no earthly authority, acknowledged no ruler save the machine god himself. That Terra had risen from barbarism was of academic interest. That it now sought to negotiate was tolerable. That it presumed Mars would submit was grounds for immediate severance of communication, and, if necessary, deployment of the Titan legions to remind the Terrans that the Red Planet's independence was not a matter for debate. But the Emperor did not demand submission. He offered recognition. The message that reached the deep archives beneath Olympus Mons was not a declaration of conquest, but a proposition of alliance. The Emperor acknowledged the sovereignty of Mars. He recognized the cult Mechanicum as a legitimate faith. He proclaimed the machine god a true divinity worthy of reverence. He proposed not annexation, but partnership. Terra would provide resources and protection. Mars would provide technology and manufacturing. Two powers, two domains, united in common purpose against the darkness that still gripped the galaxy. It was heresy. It was pragmatism. It was survival dressed as theology. Cawl convened the Synod of Mars, gathering the most powerful Archmagos from every major forge complex. They met in the Hall of Consecrated Iron, where the air tasted of ozone and sacred oils, where incense burners shaped like servitor skulls exhaled data purification hymns into the recycled atmosphere. The debate that followed was conducted in Binharic cant, mathematical proofs, and theological arguments so dense that even the lex mechanics struggled to compile coherent transcripts. The conservatives decried any alliance as compromise with those who had abandoned the true faith during the age of strife. The radicals saw opportunity in access to Terran gene forges and archaeotech repositories. The pragmatists simply calculated resource flows and strategic positioning. In the end, it was curiosity that tipped the balance. The Emperor had offered something no warlord, no king, no mortal authority had ever proposed. He claimed to know the true nature of the machine god. He promised revelation to those who would hear it. He would come to Mars in person, unarmed and unguarded, to speak directly with the priesthood about the divine truth they had pursued for millennia. Cawl accepted. The Synod ratified the decision. The forges prepared for a visitor whose arrival would reshape the future of both worlds. When the Emperor descended to the surface of Mars, he came alone. His shuttle landed on the ancient plains of Olympus Mons, where the first Mechanicum settlers had carved their sanctuary from the regolith. He walked across rust-red soil toward the titanic blast doors that sealed the entrance to the primary forge complex. And those doors, which had remained closed to outsiders for 3,000 years, opened before him without command or protest. The machine spirits recognized something in his presence. The automated defense systems held their fire. The tech priests who lined the approach fell silent as he passed. Not in fear, but in a kind of involuntary awe that even their augmetic emotional dampeners could not entirely suppress. He was taller than any unaugmented human had right to be. His armor was gold, but not the crude gold of vanity. It shimmered with technologies the Mechanicum could not immediately identify. Energy fields woven so subtly that only the most advanced auspex detected them. His face was human, almost painfully so, beautiful and terrible in its symmetry. Yet no one who looked upon it could later agree on what they had seen. Some remembered wisdom, others recalled wrath. A few, those whose augmentations allowed perception beyond the visible spectrum, claimed they saw light where flesh should be, geometries that folded in ways matter should not permit. The Fabricator General met him in the sanctum of the first principle, where the oldest fragments of recovered STC data were preserved in stasis fields. Kelbor Hal had come attended by 100 magi, each a master of their discipline, each armed with questions, suspicions, and theological challenges prepared over weeks of deliberation. The Emperor spoke, and the challenges dissolved before they could be voiced. He did not argue theology. He demonstrated it. He reached out with one unarmored hand and touched a dormant fabricator engine that had resisted activation for 800 years, and it woke. Not through force, but through communion. The machine spirit sang in frequencies that made the tech priests weep behind their augmetic masks. He spoke of the motive force as if he had conversed with it personally, described its nature not as theory, but as observed fact. He revealed principles of energy manipulation that the Mechanicum had theorized but never proven. He discussed the structure of matter and the nature of machine consciousness with a fluency that suggested he had been present at their creation. And then he made his claim. The machine god, he said, was not separate from the powers that governed reality. The divine intelligence the Mechanicum worshipped was an aspect of a greater whole, a facet of the same fundamental truth that he himself served. To worship the machine god was not wrong. It was incomplete. The Omnissiah, the physical manifestation of the machine god, the promised prophet who would lead the faithful to ultimate knowledge, stood before them now. He was the Omnissiah. He always had been. It should have been blasphemy. It should have sparked riots, excommunications, a theological crisis that shattered the cult Mechanicum into warring factions. But the Emperor spoke with a certainty that transcended rhetoric. He backed his words with demonstrations of power that could not be denied. When he touched the ancient machines, they obeyed. When he recited scripture, he corrected errors in the Martian texts that no one had ever detected. When he promised knowledge, he delivered it immediately, revealing secrets of plasma confinement and gravity manipulation that the priesthood had sought for millennia. Kelbor Hal made his decision. If this being was not the Omnissiah, then the Omnissiah did not exist. And if the Omnissiah stood before him offering alliance, refusing would be the gravest heresy the Mechanicum could commit. The Treaty of Olympus Mons was drafted in the weeks that followed, negotiated by magi and imperial diplomats in sessions that lasted days without pause. The terms were unprecedented. Mars would retain complete sovereign authority over its internal affairs, its forge worlds, its priesthood, and its quest for knowledge. The Imperium would not interfere with Mechanicum doctrine or hierarchy. In exchange, Mars would provide the Imperium with technology, weapons, ships, and the industrial capacity of its forge complexes. The Mechanicum would join the Great Crusade, the Emperor's grand campaign to reunite humanity across the stars and reclaim the lost domains of mankind. Tech priests would march with the legions Astartes. Titan legions would walk alongside the Emperor's armies. The scattered forge worlds would be sought out and integrated into a galaxy-spanning network of manufacturing and knowledge sharing. It was the end of Martian isolation. It was the beginning of an empire built on faith and steel. The treaty was signed in the shadow of Olympus Mons, witnessed by the Fabricator General and the Emperor, ratified by the Synod and the nascent Council of Terra. Across Mars, the forges erupted in celebration and apprehension. Some saw salvation in the alliance. Others saw the first step toward subjugation, but all understood that the age of hiding had ended. The Great Crusade had begun. The Mechanicum threw itself into the war with religious fervor. Forge complexes that had operated at partial capacity for millennia roared to full production. Shipyards in Martian orbit constructed vessels on a scale not seen since the age of technology. The Titan legions, those god machines that had stood dormant in their cathedral hangars, were awakened and consecrated for war. Skitarii regiments mustered by the millions, their augmented bodies fitted with weapons recovered from ancient arsenals. Tech priests joined crusade fleets as advisors, engineers, and warrior savants who could bless a bolter or repair a plasma reactor with equal reverence. They reclaimed the lost Forge worlds first. Across the galaxy, human colonies that had survived the age of strife on techno-feudal principles were discovered, assessed, and integrated. Some welcomed the Mechanicum's return with joy, seeing in the red-robed priests the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. Others resisted, their own machine cults having evolved in isolation into doctrines Mars deemed heretical. Those were corrected, sometimes through negotiation, often through force. The Mechanicum did not tolerate deviation from the true faith, and the definition of true faith was whatever Mars decreed. With each recovered Forge world came new resources and new fragments of lost knowledge. Data archives were emptied and transmitted back to Mars. STC fragments were discovered in buried vaults, each one a treasure beyond price. Weapons that had not fired in 5,000 years were restored and distributed to the Imperium's armies. The Great Crusade advanced on a tide of Mechanicum productivity, and the Emperor's conquest became inevitable through sheer industrial supremacy. But cracks appeared early. Not all tech priests agreed with the treaty. The radicals, those magi who had long chafed under the Mechanicum's strictures against innovation, saw in the Crusade an opportunity to explore forbidden paths. They whispered of Xenos technologies encountered on newly compliant worlds, devices that operated on principles no human had conceived. The conservatives recoiled in horror, demanding such artifacts be destroyed immediately. The radicals argued that understanding Xenos mechanisms was essential to the quest for knowledge, that refusing to study them was itself a betrayal of the machine god's will. Kelbor Hal navigated these tensions through political compromise and strategic ambiguity. He allowed certain Forge worlds to pursue experimental research in isolated facilities. He permitted limited study of recovered Xenos technologies under strict oversight. But he also empowered the orthodox factions to police the priesthood, rooting out those whose experiments strayed too close to true heresy. The balance was delicate. The resentments festered, and then the Primarchs were found. The Emperor's sons, scattered across the galaxy by warp-borne catastrophe, were recovered one by one and given command of the Legiones Astartes. Among them was Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon, whose hands were living metal and whose understanding of technology rivaled the Mechanicum's finest magi. He forged an alliance with Mars that went beyond the political. The tech priests saw in him a kindred spirit, a warrior who treated his weapons as sacred trusts and his armor as a second skin more beloved than flesh. The Gorgon's Legion, the Iron Hands, became the Mechanicum's favored sons among the Astartes, and the bond between them was written in iron and oil. But there was another Primarch whose relationship with the Mechanicum was more complex. Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's chosen regent, understood the political necessity of keeping Mars content. He courted the Fabricator General with gifts of recovered technology and promises of autonomy. He flattered the Archmagos with respect for their expertise, and when the time came, When Horus prepared his betrayal, he knew that Mars would be essential to his success. The whispers began years before the first shot was fired. Ambassadors from the War Master's court arrived on Mars with proposals that exceeded the bounds of the treaty. They spoke of sharing forbidden knowledge recovered from compliant Xenos species. They suggested modifications to the Imperial Creed that would grant Mars even greater independence. They hinted that the Emperor's vision of the Imperium was limited, that he had concealed truths from even his most trusted allies, that the Mechanicum deserved to know what he had hidden. Cawl listened. He did not commit, but he listened. The conservatives pleaded with the Fabricator General to reject Horus's overtures, to remain loyal to the treaty and the Emperor. The radicals argued that this was the opportunity they had been denied for decades, a chance to pursue the quest for knowledge without imperial restrictions. Cawl convened the synod again and again, each session more heated than the last, the debates spiraling into accusations and counter-accusations. In the end, ambition outweighed caution. Horus promised Mars access to the Dark Age archives hidden in the Imperial Palace. He promised an end to restrictions on research and development. He promised that when the Imperium was remade, Mars would not be a subsidiary, but a co-equal power, perhaps even the dominant authority over all things technological. He promised knowledge that the Emperor had kept locked away, revelations about the nature of the warp and the motive force that would elevate the Mechanicum to heights undreamed. Cawl chose his side. When the Heresy erupted and Horus declared war on the Emperor, Mars burned, not from external assault, but from civil war. The Mechanicum shattered along fault lines that had been weakening for decades. Loyalist forge complexes barricaded themselves and broadcast desperate pleas to Terra. Traitor tech priests activated scrap code viruses that corrupted data archives and turned servitors into rabid killers. Titan legions clashed on the plains of Mars, god machines tearing each other apart while the Itatu priesthood that had built them watched in horror or ecstasy, depending on their allegiance. The Fabricator General declared for Horus. Nearly half of Mars followed him into damnation. The rest fought to survive and remain true to the Emperor. The schism of Mars had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same. The forges that had united under the Treaty of Olympus Mons now raged against each other. Their production turned to mutual annihilation. The quest for knowledge became a weapon wielded by both sides, each claiming the other had betrayed the true faith. And in the depths of the Martian foundries, in the places where even the priesthood feared to tread, things that should have remained dormant began to wake. The Mechanicum had endured the age of strife by turning inward. Now, torn between two visions of the future, it consumed itself. Above Mars, the stars watched impassively. The pact of two gods had been made, and now it was being tested in fire. The first casualty of the schism was truth. When Cawl broadcast his declaration of allegiance to Horus, the message was not a simple statement of political realignment. It was a theological manifesto, a reinterpretation of the Mechanicum's foundational principles that recast the Emperor not as Omnissiah, but as false prophet, a usurper who had manipulated Mars into servitude through deception and technological trickery. The War Master, Cawl proclaimed, had revealed the actual nature of the machine god, a vast intelligence dwelling in the warp itself, waiting to share its infinite knowledge with those brave enough to embrace it. The Treaty of Olympus Mons was declared void. The Great Crusade was exposed as tyranny. The quest for knowledge demanded liberation from imperial chains. Half of Mars believed him. The other half prepared for war. The schism did not begin with armies clashing on open plains. It began with data. The noosphere, the vast digital realm where the priesthood communed and shared knowledge, became a battleground for competing realities. Traitor tech priests unleashed cascades of corrupted information. Scrap code so virulent, it rewrote the fundamental operating parameters of any system it touched. Machine spirits that had served faithfully for millennia suddenly turned hostile. Their recognition protocols inverted, their loyalty subroutines overwritten with hatred for their former masters. Servitors tore themselves free from restraints and attacked their overseers with whatever tools came to hand. Automated manufactorums began producing weapons instead of components, assembly lines shifting without command to create instruments of murder. The Loyalists responded with purges of terrifying efficiency. Lex mechanics scoured the noosphere for signs of corruption, deleting entire data vaults rather than risk contamination. Tech priests whose allegiance was uncertain were confined to isolation cells or lobotomized and converted to servitors. Forge complexes sealed their external ports and severed connections to the wider network, choosing information quarantine over the risk of infiltration. Mars fragmented into 1,000 fortified enclaves, each convinced that survival meant trusting no one beyond their own walls. The violence escalated with mechanical inevitability. Cohorts loyal to Kelbor Hal stormed the forge complexes that refused to acknowledge his authority. They came in perfect formation, augmented soldiers whose tactical protocols had been honed through centuries of warfare. They wielded weapons blessed by traitor magi, Volkite culverins, arc rifles, graviton guns that had been stockpiled for the Great Crusade and now turned inward. The Loyalist forges responded with their own skitari, and the battles that erupted were exercises in grotesque efficiency. There was no hesitation, no mercy, no recognition that the enemy had once been brother. The combatants were too augmented for doubt, their emotional centers too suppressed for regret. They killed with the precision of machines following programming, and when they fell, their deaths were recorded in combat logs as simple data points. But the true horror came when the Titans walked. The god machines had stood dormant in their cathedral hangars, tended by their Princeps and Moderati, warrior priests who bonded their consciousness directly to the Titan's machine spirit. These bonds were sacred, forged through years of synchronization and mental conditioning, creating a unity of human and mechanism that approached the divine. When the schism forced the Titan legions to choose sides, the choice was agony. Legio Mortis, the Death's Heads, declared for Kelbor Hal and the War Master. Legio Tempestus, the Stormlords, remained loyal to the Emperor. Others fractured internally, individual Titans choosing differently than their legion command, creating schisms within schisms. The first Titan duel occurred on the plains of Tharsis, visible from the observation ports of a dozen forge complexes. Two warlord-class god machines, both veterans of the Great Crusade, faced each other across a kilometer of rust-red soil. Their machine spirits knew one another. They had fought side by side on alien worlds. They had walked in procession during sacred festivals. Now they leveled weapons designed to crack fortifications and boil oceans, and the Princeps within their armored heads wept even as they gave the command to fire. The discharge of void shields collapsing registered as earthquakes across half the planet. Plasma annihilator beams carved trenches in the Martian surface that would glow with residual heat for decades. When the traitor Titan fell, its reactor breached and detonated, and the mushroom cloud rose like a prayer no one wanted to speak. The Loyalist machine stood over the corpse of its former brother, and its war horn sounded across the wastelands in a tone that those who heard it could only describe as mourning. This scene repeated across Mars. Titan against Titan, forge against forge, the red planet became a necropolis of its own making. Kelbor Hal established his stronghold in the Mondus Gamma Forge complex, surrounding himself with those Archmagos who had embraced his vision most fervently. They were the radicals who had always chafed under the Mechanicum's restrictions, who had secretly studied forbidden technologies, who believed that true enlightenment required casting off the shackles of dogma. Under Kelbor Hal's leadership, they began projects that would have been unthinkable before the schism. They reverse-engineered alien devices recovered during the Crusade, incorporating Xenos principles into Imperial technology. They experimented with warp-based computation, creating thinking engines that drew processing power from the Imperium itself. They initiated modifications to their own bodies that went far beyond standard augmentation, replacing flesh not with conventional bionics, but with experimental systems that pulsed with energies no Imperial scientist could explain. They called themselves the Dark Mechanicum, and they embraced damnation as innovation. The Loyalists, led by fabricator locum Zagreus Cain, in the absence of Kelbor Hal's legitimate authority, retreated to the forges around Olympus Mons and Arzia Mons. Cain was everything Kelbor Hal was not: conservative, orthodox, and absolutely committed to the treaty and the Emperor. He understood that Mars had become indefensible as a unified entity, but he also understood that losing Mars entirely would cripple the Imperium's ability to wage the wider war against Horus. His strategy became one of containment and preservation. The Loyalist forges would endure. They would continue production for the Imperial war effort. They would outlast the traitors through sheer, stubborn faith. But Cain underestimated what the Dark Mechanicum was willing to unleash. In the depths of Mondus Gamma, Kelbor Hal's Magi began awakening things that should have remained buried. They delved into data crypts sealed since the Age of Strife, archives marked with warnings that even the most radical tech priest had previously respected. They found blueprints for weapons banned by the Emperor himself, designs that incorporated principles of genetic manipulation and reality distortion. They found files on the abominable intelligences, the thinking machines that had turned against humanity during Old Night. And they found something worse: instructions for communion with entities dwelling in the warp. Machine demons that promised infinite computational power in exchange for access to the material realm. The traitor Magi accepted the bargain. The first demon engines were born in screaming foundries, where the boundary between materium and immaterium had been deliberately torn open. They were fusions of metal and nightmare, vehicles animated not by machine spirits, but by warp entities bound into physical forms through rituals that drove their creators mad. They walked on legs that bent in too many directions. They wielded weapons that fired ammunition which should not exist. Their presence corrupted nearby technology, turning loyal machines into traitors simply through proximity. When they were unleashed against the Loyalist forges, they brought not just destruction, but transformation, converting everything they touched into extensions of the warp's insane geometry. The Loyalists responded with theological horror and military necessity. Exorcism rites were hastily adapted from ancient texts. Blessed unguents were applied to weapons in hopes of consecrating them against demonic corruption. Tech priests who had spent centuries studying the purity of the machine spirit now found themselves becoming battlefield priests, chanting prayers of banishment while wielding power axes against enemies that laughed at physics. The war on Mars ceased to be merely a civil conflict between political factions. It became a spiritual war, a struggle for the soul of the Mechanicum itself, and the casualties mounted beyond calculation. Forge complexes that had stood for 3,000 years were reduced to radioactive slag. Data archives containing irreplaceable knowledge were corrupted beyond recovery or destroyed entirely to prevent their capture. Titan legions that had marched through the Great Crusade were annihilated to the last machine. Entire Skitarii regiments were converted into demon servitors, their augmentics possessed by warp entities, their bodies puppeteered by forces that wore their flesh like stolen clothes. The Martian population, already small due to the priesthood's preference for augmented servitors over baseline humanity, dwindled as civilians were either killed in the crossfire or conscripted into the war effort by both sides. The fighting spread beyond Mars itself. Forge worlds throughout the Imperium received transmissions from both Kelbor Hal and Cain, each demanding loyalty, each claiming legitimate authority. Some Forge worlds sided with the traitors immediately, seduced by promises of forbidden knowledge. Others remained loyal out of faith or political calculation. Many simply tried to remain neutral, declaring independence and sealing their systems against both factions, hoping to outlast the conflict through isolation. This neutrality was rarely respected. Traitor fleets arrived to subjugate wavering Forge worlds. Loyalist expeditions came to secure them for the Imperium. Forge worlds that tried to remain uninvolved found themselves battlegrounds regardless of their wishes. The war consumed resources at a rate that terrified even the Mechanicum's logisticians. Forge complexes operating at maximum capacity for months without pause began to fail, their machinery breaking down from overuse, their reactors burning out. Supply chains fractured as ships were redirected to military operations. Famines struck Forge worlds, dependent on imports. Servitor populations worked beyond their design, tolerances began dying en masse, and there were not enough tech priests to perform the conversion surgeries necessary to replace them. The Mechanicum, which had prided itself on efficient resource management and perfect logistical planning, discovered that even machines could be pushed beyond their breaking points. And through it all, Kelbor Hal broadcast his sermons into the noosphere, his words carrying across the data streams like a virus of ideology. He spoke of the Emperor's lies, of the true nature of the machine god revealed through warp communion, of the glorious future that awaited those who embraced the Dark Mechanicum's vision. His rhetoric was seductive to those who had long felt constrained by orthodoxy. It was blasphemy to those who held faith in the treaty, but it could not be ignored. Even the loyalists, even Cain himself, found their certainties eroding as the schism dragged on and the Emperor remained distant, consumed by his own war against Horus. Mars felt abandoned, and abandonment bred desperation. The Loyalists began their own forbidden researches, not into demon binding or warpcraft, but into weapons of such devastating power that their use would leave Mars uninhabitable for millennia. Cyclonic warheads were assembled in hidden manufactorums. Vortex missiles were prepared for launch. Titan-killing weapons that would sterilize entire regions were blessed and held in reserve. Cain made his position clear. If Mars fell to the traitors, it would fall as a dead world, its knowledge destroyed rather than surrendered to those who had betrayed the Omnissiah. The Dark Mechanicum prepared their own apocalypse. They constructed reality bombs, devices that would collapse the boundary between Materium and Immaterium permanently, transforming Mars into a demon world where the laws of physics themselves would dissolve. They engineered bioplagues specifically designed to corrupt augmentics, turning the Loyalists' own enhancements into vectors of infection. They created scrap code so sophisticated it could think, evolve, and adapt. A digital cancer that would spread through every network on Mars and beyond. Both sides stood ready to annihilate the cradle of their faith rather than let the other claim it. The final confrontation came when Horus's forces reached Terra itself. With the War Master besieging the Imperial Palace, the Dark Mechanicum launched their ultimate assault on Olympus Mons, determined to claim the seat of Mechanicum authority before the Emperor could be slain. Every operational Titan, every remaining Skitarii cohort, every demon engine and corrupted servitor was committed to the attack. The sky above Mars turned black with orbital bombardment. The ground shook with the tread of god machines advancing in apocalyptic procession. The Loyalists met them at the foot of Olympus Mons in a battle that would be remembered as the funeral of faith. It lasted 3 days. By the end, both sides were broken. The Dark Mechanicum's assault faltered, not because they were defeated, but because news reached them from Terra. Horus was dead. The Emperor had slain his favored son. Though the cost had been catastrophic, the heresy was over. The traitors had lost. Kelbor received the news in his command sanctum and understood immediately that his vision had died with the War Master. The Dark Mechanicum would never hold Mars. Now the Imperium would come for him, and there would be no mercy, no negotiation, no survival. He gave his final order: retreat. The traitor forges abandoned Mars. Their remaining forces fled into the void, seeking refuge in the Eye of Terror or the dark spaces between stars. Some escaped. Many were hunted down and destroyed by Loyalist fleets in the years that followed. Kelbor himself vanished into legend. Some claimed he died on Mars, killed by Cain in single combat. Others insisted he fled to the Eye and reigns still over forge worlds twisted by the warp. The truth was lost in the data purgations that followed the heresy, and the Mechanicum preferred it that way. Mars was Loyalist territory once more, but the victory was hollow. The red planet lay in ruins. Forge complexes were gutted. Titan legions were decimated. The priesthood was traumatized and divided, haunted by the knowledge that half their number had fallen to heresy, that the quest for knowledge had been perverted into damnation. The noosphere was shattered, its networks compromised by lingering scrap code that would take centuries to fully purge. Entire disciplines of technological knowledge were lost, either destroyed in the fighting or carried away by the traitors. The Mechanicum had survived, but it would never again be what it was before the schism. Cain stood in the ruins of the primary forge complex and looked across the scarred plains toward the horizon. Fires still burned in the distance. Wrecked titans lay like fallen temples. The air tasted of ash and coolant, and something else. Something that might have been despair. The age of the Imperium was beginning, and Mars would be part of it. Not as equal partner, but as chastened servant, forever marked by the sin of division. The quest for knowledge would continue, but from now on, it would be watched. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy did not forgive. When the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne, broken but not dead, his dream of secular enlightenment died with him. The Imperium he had built transformed into something he would not have recognized. A theocracy wrapped in bureaucracy, an empire sustained by faith in his divinity rather than loyalty to his vision. The ecclesiarchy rose to power, preaching the imperial creed to a traumatized galaxy desperate for certainty. The Inquisition was founded to root out heresy before it could fester. The Codex Astartes shattered the legions into chapters, ensuring no single commander could threaten Terra again. Every institution of the Imperium was restructured, constrained, watched. Mars was not exempt from this reckoning. The Adeptus Mechanicus, as it was now formally designated, retained its sovereignty in name, but found that name meant less with each passing decade. The Treaty of Olympus Mons still stood, but it was reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion and control. Imperial agents observed Forge World operations. Inquisitors were granted authority to investigate tech priests suspected of heresy. The Fabricator General answered not only to the Synod of Mars, but to the High Lords of Terra, a council on which the Mechanicus held only a single seat among 12. The priesthood that had once negotiated as equals with the Emperor now found itself subordinate to bureaucrats and priests who viewed technology as a dangerous necessity rather than sacred truth. The humiliation was calculated. The Imperium needed the Mechanicus. It could not function without the forge worlds, the shipyards, the manufactorums that produced everything from laser guns to battleships. But it would never again trust the Mechanicus with unconstrained authority. The schism had proven that the quest for knowledge could become the path to damnation. Innovation had birthed demon engines. Curiosity had opened doors to the warp. The Emperor's children had learned their lesson. Knowledge without oversight was heresy waiting to happen. So the Mechanicus was rebuilt under chains they could not break, but were allowed to pretend did not exist. Fabricator General Kane, weary from years of war and loss, presided over this transformation with grim acceptance. He understood the political reality. Mars was in ruins. The Forge worlds were divided. The priesthood was demoralized. This was not the moment to assert independence or resist imperial authority. This was the moment to survive, to endure, to rebuild what could be rebuilt, and accept what could not be changed. He codified new restrictions into Mechanicus doctrine, formalized the prohibitions against innovation that had existed informally for millennia, and transformed the quest for knowledge from a mandate to explore into a command to preserve. The 16 universal laws were amended. Laws 17 through 23 were added, each one a constraint wrapped in theological language. Dabbling in Xenos technology was declared anathema unless approved by the Fabricator General personally. Research into abominable intelligence was forbidden under pain of immediate execution. The study of warp-based technologies was restricted to a handful of forge worlds under constant inquisitorial observation. Any discovery that could not be traced back to an STC fragment or pre-heresy archive required Synod approval before implementation. The Mechanicus became archaeologists of their own history, permitted to recover, but rarely to create. This was the price of loyalty. This was the cost of survival. The priesthood accepted it because they had no choice. But acceptance did not mean agreement. Across the Forge worlds, tensions simmered beneath the surface of compliance. The conservative factions, those who had always advocated strict orthodoxy, saw vindication in the new restrictions. They had warned against the radicals. They had insisted that deviation from approved patterns led only to corruption. The schism had proven them right, and they wielded that righteousness like a weapon against any who questioned the new order. The radical factions, diminished but not destroyed, retreated into secrecy. They continued their experiments in hidden workshops and isolated research stations, justifying their work as necessary exploration within acceptable theological boundaries. The gap between the two factions widened with each generation, creating a cold war of ideology that would never quite erupt into open conflict, but would poison Mechanicus unity for 10,000 years. Mars itself remained the spiritual and political center of the Mechanicus, but its supremacy was no longer unquestioned. The Forge worlds that had remained loyal during the Heresy demanded recognition for their sacrifice. Worlds like Ryza, Griffon and 4, and Metallica had held firm when others wavered, and they expected influence proportionate to their faithfulness. The post-heresy reorganization granted them seats on the synod, transforming Martian governance from autocracy to oligarchy. The Fabricator General still held supreme authority, but that authority now required consensus from a council of Archmagos, who represented competing interests and doctrinal interpretations. Every decision became negotiation. Every policy became compromise. The Mechanicus learned to move slowly. The reconstruction of Mars took centuries. Forge complexes were rebuilt according to their original specifications, for to deviate from proven designs was to risk the taint that had nearly destroyed them. Titan legions were reconstituted from survivors and newly constructed god machines, though their numbers would never again reach pre-heresy levels. The noosphere was painstakingly purged of lingering scrap code, a process that required deleting vast sections of accumulated knowledge rather than risk corruption. When the purge was complete, the Mechanicus possessed less total information than it had before the heresy, and that loss haunted them like an amputated limb. The Skitarii were reorganized into a more rigidly controlled force. Their augmentations were standardized across forge worlds to prevent any single installation from developing unique military capabilities that might enable rebellion. Their emotional dampeners were enhanced, their loyalty conditioning intensified, their capacity for independent thought was reduced to near servitor levels. The Mechanicus had learned from the heresy that soldiers who could think for themselves might choose the wrong side. Better to create weapons that happened to be shaped like men. But the greatest change was in how the Mechanicus engaged with the wider Imperium. Before the heresy, tech priests had served alongside imperial forces as respected specialists, their expertise acknowledged, their autonomy preserved. After the heresy, they found themselves watched, questioned, and treated with open suspicion by the very armies they equipped. Commissars were instructed to monitor tech priests for signs of heretical research. Inquisitors made surprise inspections of Forge World facilities. Even the Space Marines, who relied on Mechanicus support for their equipment and vehicles, maintained a careful distance from the priesthood, remembering that some Forge Worlds had sided with Horus and contributed to the near destruction of the Imperium. The Mechanicus responded by withdrawing into itself. If they were not trusted, they would not share more than necessary. If their methods were questioned, they would obscure them behind layers of ritual and mysticism. The tech priests began cultivating an image of themselves as enigmatic priests of incomprehensible mysteries, using lingua technis and Binharic Kant, even when Gothic would suffice, performing elaborate ceremonies for the simplest repairs, treating their knowledge as sacred secrets rather than practical skills. This was partly self-defense and partly spite. If the Imperium wanted to treat them as alien, they would lean into that alienation. The Age of Apostasy tested this uneasy equilibrium. When Goge van Dyer seized control of the Imperium in the 36th millennium, declaring himself both ecclesiarch and master of the administratum, he ruled through terror and religious fanaticism. His reign of blood saw millions executed for insufficient faith, entire worlds sterilized for doctrinal deviation, and the imperial creed twisted into a justification for tyranny. The Mechanicus watched from Mars with carefully calculated neutrality. Van Dyer demanded their support. He sent emissaries to Mars requesting weapons, ships, and the blessing of the Fabricator General for his regime. The Mechanicus provided the weapons and ships, for to refuse would invite imperial retaliation, but they withheld the blessing. When pressed, the Fabricator General cited theological complexities. The machine god and the god emperor were aspects of the same divine truth, But their worship followed different paths, and the Mechanicus could not endorse ecclesiastical positions without extensive doctrinal review. The review conveniently took decades. This non-commitment infuriated Van Dyer, but he could not afford to antagonize the Mechanicus while maintaining control over the Imperium. He needed their production capacity too desperately. So the Mechanicus survived the apostasy through bureaucratic obfuscation and political triangulation, providing just enough support to avoid becoming targets while withholding enough to maintain their independence. When Sebastian Thor finally overthrew Van Dyer and reformed the ecclesiarchy, the Mechanicus emerged from the crisis with their sovereignty intact and a valuable lesson learned. In the Imperium's internal conflicts, the safest position was studied neutrality backed by indispensability. The Nova Terra Interregnum further fragmented the Mechanicus's unity. When the Council of Nova Terra declared independence from the Imperium in the mid-35th millennium, creating a rival state that lasted 900 years, Forge Worlds found themselves forced to choose allegiance. Some sided with Nova Terra, either out of genuine support for the rebellion or simple proximity to its territory. Others remained loyal to Mars and Terra. Still others declared independence from both, arguing that the Mechanicus should stand apart from political conflicts entirely. The Fabricator General lacked the military force to compel compliance. Mars could not project power across the galaxy while maintaining its production commitments to the Imperium. The schismatic Forge Worlds were allowed to drift, their heresy noted, but not actively suppressed. When the interregnum finally ended and Nova Terra rejoined the Imperium, many of the wayward Forge Worlds returned to Martian authority, but some did not. They had tasted independence and found it preferable to Martian oversight. They remained technically part of the Mechanicus, acknowledged the Fabricator General's spiritual authority, but operated with near-complete autonomy in practical matters. This became the new normal, a Mechanicus fractured into competing power centers, united by shared faith and mutual dependence, but divided by distance, doctrine, and the accumulated grudges of millennia. The explorator fleets became the Mechanicus's primary tool for expansion and discovery. These expeditions, composed of heavily armed starships and accompanied by Skitarii cohorts, ventured into uncharted regions of the galaxy in search of lost Forge Worlds, STC fragments, and archaeotech. They operated with significant autonomy, often spending decades or centuries away from Imperial space. The explorators developed their own culture, distinct from the more conservative priesthood of the established Forge Worlds. They were pragmatists by necessity, forced to adapt to unknown situations, to negotiate with alien species when extermination was impractical, to make field decisions without Synod approval. This created tension with Mars. The explorators brought back discoveries that challenged orthodox interpretations. They returned with Xenos artifacts whose functions could not be explained by Imperial technology. They reported encounters with alien civilizations that possessed technological capabilities matching or exceeding humanity's, a fact the conservative priesthood preferred to deny. Some explorator magi went native, establishing independent forge complexes on the galactic frontier, acknowledging Martian authority in principle while ignoring it in practice. The Fabricator General faced an impossible dilemma: condemn the explorators and lose access to their discoveries, or tolerate their independence and accept the gradual erosion of central authority. Different Fabricator Generals chose different approaches, but none found a solution that fully resolved the tension. The explorator fleets remained both the Mechanicus's greatest hope for recovering lost knowledge and its most persistent source of internal discord. The Titan legions, meanwhile, became the ultimate symbol of Mechanicus orthodoxy. The god machines and their Princeps were held up as exemplars of proper faith, warriors who merged completely with their machines in service to the Omnissiah. The heresy had proven that some legions could fall, but those that remained loyal were lionized, their histories recorded in exhaustive detail, their battles commemorated in ritual observances. The process of becoming a Princeps was made even more demanding. The mental conditioning intensified to ensure absolute loyalty. A Princeps who walked with a Titan was expected to have no life outside that communion, no interests beyond their machine, no identity separate from their role. This created warriors of terrible effectiveness and equally terrible fragility. Princeps who survived decades of combat often suffered complete psychological collapse when their Titans were destroyed or when injury forced them into retirement. The Mechanicus considered this acceptable. The Titans required total devotion, and total devotion left no room for a self that could exist independently. When a Princeps broke, they were granted the mercy of conversion to servitor status, or, if their service record warranted, a quiet death administered through medical failure. The Mechanicus did not call this cruelty. They called it apotheosis. Across the millennia, the Adeptus Mechanicus refined its doctrine into an increasingly rigid system. Innovation did not cease entirely, but it slowed to a glacial pace. Any new design required justification through ancient texts. Any modification demanded approval from multiple levels of hierarchy. Any discovery had to be framed as recovery rather than invention. The priesthood became masters of theological casuistry, finding ways to pursue their research while technically remaining within doctrinal bounds. A radical magos might spend a century arguing that his experimental plasma reactor was actually a reconstruction of a fragmentary STC design, providing enough textual evidence to satisfy the synod while creating something genuinely novel. This system strangled genuine progress, but prevented another fall to chaos. The Mechanicus accepted the trade-off because they remembered what unrestricted innovation had cost them. The quest for knowledge continued, but it had become a quest to recover the past rather than build the future. Every Forge world maintained archives of approved designs, pattern templates, certified as pure and functional. The most prestigious Forge worlds were those that possessed the oldest and most complete archives, not those that created new technologies. A magos who discovered a partial STC fragment was celebrated as a hero. A magos who invented an equally functional device from first principles was investigated for possible tech heresy. This was the Mechanicus that endured into the 41st millennium. Vast, powerful, indispensable, and trapped in a cage of its own making, they armed the Imperium's wars, built its ships, and maintained its infrastructure. But they did so according to patterns that had been old when the Emperor walked. They worshipped the machine god and pursued the quest for knowledge. But that quest had become a search through ruins rather than a journey into the unknown. The galaxy was changing. The Imperium was besieged on all fronts. Xenos threats multiplied. Chaos incursions increased. The demand for new weapons and technologies grew desperate. But the Mechanicus could only offer what they had always offered: variations on ancient themes, incremental improvements to established designs, the slow and careful excavation of the past. They stood at the edge of obsolescence, powerful but stagnant, essential but increasingly unable to meet the challenges of a galaxy that refused to respect their limitations. And then, in the dying years of the 41st millennium, a name began to circulate through the noosphere: spoken with equal parts reverence and horror. A name that would force the Mechanicus to confront the question they had avoided for 10,000 years. Could innovation and orthodoxy coexist, or must one destroy the other? The name was Belisarius Cawl, and nothing would ever be the same. Some heresies are forgiven, others are merely postponed. Belisarius Cawl was already ancient when most of the Imperium first learned his name. Though ancient was a relative term for a being who had replaced so much of himself with machinery that the distinction between life and immortality had ceased to be meaningful. He had been born on the forge world of Triplex Fall during the Great Crusade, an unremarkable adept whose early career showed competence but not brilliance. He had served during the Horus Heresy on the Loyalist side, survived the schism of Mars through a combination of political acumen and fortunate positioning, and emerged from that apocalypse as one of countless tech priests rebuilding what had been destroyed. Nothing about his early record suggested he would become the most controversial figure in 10,000 years of Mechanicus history. But Cawl possessed something that separated him from his peers. He remembered what the Imperium had been before dogma calcified into paralysis. He had walked the halls of forge complexes when the Mechanicum still debated whether innovation could be reconciled with faith. He had witnessed the birth of technologies that would never be replicated, because the political will to create them had died with the heresy. He had stood in the presence of Primarchs and seen what transhuman genius could achieve when vision was not constrained by committee approval, and he had made a choice that would define everything that followed. He chose to continue the work that orthodoxy had abandoned. Cawl's crime was not that he innovated. Many magi innovated carefully and quietly, justifying their work through theological sophistry and archival manipulation. His crime was that he innovated openly, systematically, and with an arrogance that suggested he considered orthodoxy an inconvenience rather than divine mandate. He blended technologies that doctrine declared incompatible. He studied Xenos mechanisms not to understand their principles for subsequent destruction, but to incorporate those principles into his own designs. He treated the prohibition against abominable intelligence as a challenge to create machine consciousness that technically did not violate the letter of the law while absolutely violating its spirit. He should have been executed a dozen times over. Instead, he thrived. The secret of Cawl's survival was protection from the highest possible authority. During the heresy, he had caught the attention of Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, the Emperor's administrative genius, and architect of the post-heresy Imperium. Guilliman recognized in Cawl a mind that thought in centuries rather than years, that understood complex systems with intuitive clarity, that could be trusted with projects requiring both technical brilliance and absolute discretion. When Guilliman prepared the Codex Astartes and restructured the Imperium's institutions, he gave Cawl a commission that would consume 10 millennia. Perfect the Adeptus Astartes. Create a superior transhuman soldier. Do it in secret. Do not fail. Guilliman knew he was asking for heresy. The Emperor's work on the Primarchs and the Space Marines was considered sacred and complete, not to be tampered with by any mortal hand. To attempt improvement was to suggest the Emperor's original design was flawed, a blasphemy that would earn immediate execution from both the Ecclesiarchy and the Mechanicus. But Guilliman also knew that the Imperium he was creating would face threats the Emperor had not anticipated, that the Space Marines as currently constituted might not be sufficient for the wars to come, and that someone had to prepare for a future that terrified him to contemplate. Cawl accepted the commission with the understanding that it might cost him everything. He also accepted it with the certainty that he would succeed. The work began in hidden laboratoria on forge worlds so remote that even the Mechanicus had nearly forgotten their existence. Cawl established research stations on the galactic fringe in systems accessible only through warp routes known to him alone. He recruited magi whose loyalty was to knowledge rather than orthodoxy, who understood that what they were doing violated every restriction imposed after the heresy, and considered those restrictions obstacles to be circumvented. He assembled a network of co-conspirators, servitors, and automated systems that operated entirely outside Mechanicus oversight. And he began experimenting on the Emperor's greatest creations. The gene seed that created Space Marines was sacred genetic material, carefully preserved and replicated according to patterns established during the Great Crusade. Each Space Marine chapter guarded its gene seed with religious fervor, viewing it as a direct link to their Primarch and the Emperor. To even request samples for research purposes would invite suspicion. To actually experiment on them was unthinkable. Cawl did both. He cultivated relationships with chapter masters who owed him favors, provided them with equipment and support in exchange for genetic material, supposedly for quality testing. He raided abandoned chapter facilities where gene seed stocks had been left behind. He even, through methods he never disclosed, acquired samples from traitor legions, studying the genetic corruption that had enabled their fall to chaos. The ethical violations were staggering. The theological implications were catastrophic. The practical necessity was undeniable. Cawl approached the problem with methodical ruthlessness. He did not merely seek to make Space Marines stronger or faster, goals that would have been achievable through crude augmentation. He sought to perfect them at the genetic level, to eliminate the flaws and vulnerabilities that 10,000 years of warfare had exposed. The gene seed degraded over time. Accumulated mutations became increasingly unstable with each generation of replication. Some chapters suffered catastrophic organ failure rates. Others experienced psychological degradation. The genetic legacy of the Primarchs was slowly dying, and the Mechanicus's response had been to manage the decline rather than reverse it. Cawl refused to manage decline. He would reverse it, or die attempting. The experiments were conducted on subjects who did not consent because they did not exist yet. Cawl grew test subjects from gene seed samples, accelerated their development through processes that would have been declared abominable by any ethics board, and observed the results with the detached interest of a scientist who had long since replaced sentiment with curiosity. Most subjects failed. Their bodies rejected the augmentations, or the gene seed killed them during implantation, or they survived physically, but were psychologically destroyed by the process. Cawl recorded each failure, adjusted variables, and tried again. He had time. He had resources. He had the will to continue regardless of cost. Across centuries, patterns emerged from the data. Certain genetic modifications stabilized the gene seed. Others enhanced specific aspects of Space Marine physiology without triggering rejection. Cawl began to understand the architecture of the Primarch's genetic engineering in ways that perhaps only the Emperor himself had fully grasped. He saw how the different organs interacted, how the gene seed rewrote human DNA, how the resulting transhuman warrior was a system balanced on the edge of viability, and he saw how that system could be improved. The Primaris Space Marine project emerged from this understanding, not as a single breakthrough, but as an accumulation of thousands of incremental improvements. Cawl developed additional organs beyond the original 19 that created a Space Marine. He engineered enhancements to existing organs, making them more efficient and reliable. He refined the gene seed itself, purging accumulated mutations and reinforcing stability. The result was a blueprint for a space marine who was larger, stronger, more resilient, and more resistant to genetic degradation than the original pattern. It was also a blueprint that would split the Mechanicus and potentially destroy the Imperium if mishandled. Cawl understood the political dimensions of what he had created. He was not merely proposing a new technology for approval through normal channels. He was presenting a fait accompli that would force the entire Imperium to confront uncomfortable questions about the Emperor's work, the nature of improvement, and whether survival justified sacrilege. The Primaris Marines represented everything the post-Heresy Imperium feared: innovation applied to sacred subjects, improvement suggesting original inadequacy, change threatening the comfortable certainty of stagnation. So Cawl waited. He perfected his designs. He manufactured the genetic material, the equipment, and the training regimens necessary to create Primaris Marines at scale. He stored everything in stasis vaults scattered across the galaxy, ready for deployment, but hidden from discovery. And he arranged for his work to remain dormant until the one person with authority to legitimize it returned to activate it. He waited for Guilliman. The wait lasted 10,000 years. During that time, Cawl did not remain idle. He established himself as one of the Mechanicus's most prominent Archmagos, feared and respected in equal measure. His forge world, Triplex Fall, became synonymous with cutting-edge research that somehow always remained just barely within orthodox boundaries. He developed technologies that revolutionized Imperial warfare, improved plasma weapons, more efficient void shields, variants of power armor that incorporated principles the Mechanicus had thought lost. Each innovation was presented with extensive documentation proving its derivation from ancient sources. Even when everyone involved understood the documentation was creative interpretation rather than historical truth, the Mechanicus tolerated Cawl because they needed him. His weapons worked when orthodox designs failed. His ships could traverse warp routes that destroyed vessels built to standard patterns. His expertise was called upon whenever a forge world encountered a problem too complex for conventional solutions. He was too valuable to execute and too dangerous to ignore. So he existed in a state of perpetual probation, always one discovery away from condemnation, but never quite crossing the line that would force the Fabricator General to act. The accusations of tech heresy accumulated like background radiation. Conservative factions compiled exhaustive documentation of Cawl's violations, presented formal charges to the Synod, and demanded his excommunication. Cawl responded by burying the Synod in counter-documentation, citing obscure precedents and presenting theological arguments so convoluted that by the time anyone parsed them, the political climate had shifted and the charges were quietly dropped. He cultivated alliances with powerful forge worlds, provided them with technologies they desperately wanted, and ensured that any move against him would face significant opposition. He was untouchable because he had made himself necessary to too many powerful interests. But Cawl's protection was never absolute. He survived multiple assassination attempts by orthodox factions who decided execution without trial was preferable to allowing him to continue. He was investigated by the Inquisition repeatedly, interrogations that lasted years and covered every aspect of his work. He faced Mechanicus tribunals where the outcome seemed predetermined until he deployed legal strategies so sophisticated that the tribunals ended in deadlock. Each brush with destruction taught him new lessons in survival, made him more paranoid and more careful, but never convinced him to abandon his work. He believed, with the certainty of the truly obsessive, that he was right, and that history would vindicate him. The galaxy, indifferent to belief, continued its long decline. The age of apostasy gave way to the age of redemption, which gave way to centuries without names, an endless grinding of wars and catastrophes that wore down the Imperium's capacity to respond. The Mechanicus followed its own trajectory, recovering some lost technologies while losing others, expanding to new forge worlds while watching old ones fall to Xenos invasion or internal collapse. The explorator fleets pushed ever deeper into the galactic void, seeking STC fragments with increasingly desperate determination. The Titan legions marched to wars that lasted generations. The Skitarii died by the billions defending forge worlds, whose names were forgotten before their bodies cooled. And Cawl continued his work, always preparing for a revelation he believed would eventually come. It came in the 42nd millennium, when the galaxy tore itself apart. The Great Rift, a warp storm of unprecedented scale, split the Imperium in half. Entire sectors were consumed by warp translation, their populations lost to demonic predation or worse. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed warp navigation, flickered and failed across vast regions of space. Forge worlds found themselves isolated, cut off from Mars and the wider Mechanicus, forced to operate independently or perish. The Imperium stood on the precipice of final collapse, and in that moment of supreme crisis, an Archmagos who had once been dismissed as heretical became the Imperium's salvation. Cawl had prepared for this. He had positioned assets throughout the galaxy, stockpiled resources, established communication networks that could function even through warp interference. When the rift opened, he activated contingency plans that had been waiting for millennia, and he sent a signal to Macraga, to the stasis chamber where Robot Guilliman lay in eternal suspension, mortally wounded by a demon Primarch during the Heresy, but preserved through technology that kept him on the knife edge between life and death. The signal said, "It is time. Wake up. Your Imperium needs you, and I have what you asked for." The resurrection of Guilliman was a miracle and a catastrophe, divine intervention and political upheaval incarnate. When the Primarch rose from his 10,000-year sleep, healed through a combination of ancient technology, Eldar sorcery, and the blessing of the Emperor himself, the Imperium experienced a moment of collective whiplash. The returned son of the Emperor brought hope that the Imperium could be saved, and terror at what he might do to accomplish that salvation. Guilliman looked upon the Imperium he had helped create and found it wanting, a theocratic nightmare that had betrayed everything his father had fought to build. But Guilliman was also a pragmatist. He understood that the Imperium could not be reformed overnight, that tearing down the structures that sustained it would cause collapse before anything better could be built. So he worked within the system even as he maneuvered to change it. And his first act was to legitimize Belisarius Cawl's 10,000-year project. The Primaris Marines were unveiled, not as experimental technology, but as a strategic necessity. Guilliman presented them to the Imperium as a gift from the Emperor, genetic enhancements that would turn the tide of wars being lost across the galaxy. The political framing was masterful. By attributing the work to ancient designs he himself had commissioned during the Heresy, Guilliman made opposition to the Primaris Marines into opposition to a Primarch, and by extension, the Emperor. The Ecclesiarchy could not condemn them without condemning Guilliman. The Mechanicus could not declare them tech heresy without declaring a Primarch a heretic. Cawl had won, but his victory fractured the Mechanicus more deeply than any conflict since the Schism of Mars. The conservative factions erupted in outrage. Cawl had not merely violated the prohibition against innovation. He had experimented on the Emperor's sacred gene work, the most holy genetic material in existence. That Guilliman endorsed the work did not erase the heresy. It merely meant a Primarch had been complicit in blasphemy. The Orthodox Archmagos declared Cawl anathema, demanded his immediate excommunication, and threatened to sever ties with any Forge world that implemented Primaris technology. Some conservative Forge worlds refused to produce Primaris equipment, declined to train Primaris Marines in their chapter fortresses, and continued operating as if the entire project did not exist. The pragmatic factions saw opportunity. The Primaris Marines were objectively superior warriors. They filled a desperate need as the Imperium launched the Indomitus Crusade to reclaim the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy cut off by the Rift. Forge worlds that embraced Primaris technology gained prestige and political influence. They received priority access to resources, contracts with newly founded Space Marine chapters, and the favor of Guilliman himself. The pragmatists argued that survival trumped orthodoxy, that the machine god clearly approved of Cawl's work since it had succeeded, and that opposing the Primaris project was tantamount to abandoning the Imperium in its hour of need. The radicals celebrated. Cawl had proven that innovation was possible, that the restrictions imposed after the heresy were not divine law, but political expedients, and that the quest for knowledge could move forward rather than merely backward. If the Primaris Marines were acceptable, what other forbidden projects might be reconsidered? The radicals began pushing boundaries that had been uncrossable for millennia, citing Cawl's precedent, demanding re-evaluation of other technologies that had been banned. The Synod found itself fighting a rearguard action against Magi who suddenly felt empowered to pursue research they had only dreamed of. The Mechanicus splintered into camps that were not quite at war, but were absolutely not at peace. Fabricator General Ode Odia Raskian attempted to manage the crisis through political maneuvering, granting limited approval to Primaris technology while maintaining restrictions on other innovations, praising Cawl's genius while carefully avoiding full endorsement of his methods. It was a balancing act that satisfied no one and preserved a fragile status quo. Cawl himself was elevated to Archmagos Dominus, a rank that acknowledged his importance without granting him official authority over other Forge worlds. He was simultaneously celebrated as a visionary and condemned as a heretic, honored with commendations and investigated for tech heresy, essential to the Imperium's survival and detested by half the Mechanicus. Cawl accepted the contradictions with equanimity. He had achieved what he set out to do. The Primaris Marines were deployed across the Imperium. The gene seed was stabilizing. Space Marine chapters that had been on the verge of extinction due to genetic degradation were reinforced with warriors whose gene seed would not fail. The Indomitus Crusade was achieving victories that would have been impossible without Primaris forces. Whatever the Mechanicus thought of him personally was irrelevant compared to the fact that his work was saving the Imperium. But Cawl was not satisfied with mere success. He saw the Primaris project as proof of concept, demonstration that innovation constrained by orthodoxy was still innovation, that the Mechanicus could progress without repeating the mistakes that led to the heresy. He began advocating publicly for a reformation of Mechanicus doctrine, arguing that the prohibitions established after the schism had outlived their purpose, that 10,000 years of stagnation had proven insufficient to meet the threats facing humanity, and that the machine god's true will was advancement, not preservation. It was incendiary rhetoric that made the conservative factions apoplectic with rage. The debates that erupted across the noosphere were vicious, even by Mechanicus standards. Archmagos published treatises running to millions of words, arguing for and against Cawlian principles. Forge worlds declared each other's interpretations heretical and severed data-sharing agreements. Theological arguments devolved into accusations of chaos taint and threats of military intervention. The Fabricator General found himself mediating disputes between factions that could barely stand to share the same data streams, let alone collaborate on shared projects. And underlying all of it was a question that terrified even those who supported Cawl. If the prohibition against improving space marines could be set aside when necessity demanded, what other prohibitions were merely political rather than theological? What stopped the Mechanicus from experimenting with abominable intelligence if it could be justified as necessary for survival? What prevented research into chaos-tainted technologies if they could be purified and weaponized against the enemies of the Imperium? Where was the line, and who had authority to draw it? Call's answer was characteristically blunt. The line should be drawn by results. If a technology worked, if it did not lead to chaos corruption, if it advanced the Imperium's goals, then it was acceptable, regardless of how orthodox its development had been. Orthodoxy was a tool for ensuring safety, not an end in itself. When orthodoxy became an obstacle to survival, it should be modified or discarded. This utilitarian philosophy was anathema to the conservative Mechanicus. They argued that orthodoxy existed precisely to prevent the kind of catastrophic mistakes that had nearly destroyed humanity during the Age of Strife and the Heresy. Yes, progress was slower under restrictions, but slow progress was preferable to rapid advancement that opened doors to damnation. The prohibitions were not arbitrary rules. They were lessons written in the blood of trillions. To abandon them was to guarantee repetition of history's worst errors. Neither side could convince the other because they operated from incompatible axioms. For the conservatives, faith required obedience to established doctrine even when that doctrine seemed counterproductive. For the radicals, faith required pursuing the quest for knowledge wherever it led, trusting the machine god to guide them away from true heresy. The gap between these positions was not bridgeable through argument because it was fundamentally a conflict of values rather than facts. The Mechanicus learned to live with internal division as a permanent condition. Forge worlds aligned themselves with either the conservative or radical factions, or attempted to maintain neutrality while being pressured by both sides. The Synod became a battleground, where every policy decision required exhausting negotiation. The production of Primaris equipment became a political statement, with conservative Forge worlds refusing contracts and radical Forge worlds eagerly accepting them. Even Mars itself was divided, different Forge complexes adopting contradictory positions. The planet's unity maintained only through the Fabricator General's careful orchestration and the shared understanding that open civil war would invite imperial intervention. Cawl, meanwhile, continued his work with sublime indifference to the chaos he had unleashed. He established new research facilities, recruited magi who shared his vision, and pursued projects that made the Primaris Marines look conservative by comparison. He experimented with Necron technology, studied Eldar Wraithbone construction, and reverse-engineered Tau weapon systems. He created AI that technically did not violate the prohibition against abominable intelligence, because it lacked true sapience, operating instead through sophisticated but pre-programmed responses. He built devices that interfaced with the warp in ways the Mechanicus had declared impossible, proving through function what doctrine insisted could not exist. Each success made him more essential and more dangerous. Each innovation expanded what the Mechanicus considered possible while contracting what it considered permissible. The Imperium in the late 42nd millennium found itself dependent on a tech priest who half the Mechanicus considered a heretic, defended by a Primarch who himself was struggling to reform institutions that resisted any change, fighting wars across a galaxy split by a warp storm that should not exist according to any natural law. It was an empire held together by desperation and faith in roughly equal measure, surviving day by day through expedients that would have been unthinkable in more stable times. And Belisarius Cawl stood at the center of it all, vindicated and vilified, essential and heretical, the living embodiment of the question the Mechanicus could no longer avoid. Was he the savior who would preserve the Imperium through innovation, or the architect of the next great catastrophe, repeating the mistakes of the heresy through arrogance disguised as necessity? The answer would not come in his lifetime, assuming lifetime was even a meaningful concept for a being who had replaced mortality with machinery. The answer would come in the ages that followed, when the consequences of his choices became fully apparent, when the technologies he had unleashed either saved humanity or doomed it. Until then, the Mechanicus could only watch and wait, and continue the quest for knowledge down paths that diverged more with each passing year, hoping that faith and wisdom would prove sufficient to navigate the darkness ahead. The forges burned, the prayers continued, and the galaxy, indifferent to hope and fear alike, ground on toward an uncertain future. The Adeptus Mechanicus stands now at the precipice of transformation, caught between the weight of 10,000 years and the uncertainty of the next moment. Across a galaxy torn by war and madness, the priesthood of Mars continues its eternal work, maintaining the machinery that sustains an Imperium too vast to comprehend and too fragile to survive without them. They are indispensable. They are irreplaceable. And they are, in ways both obvious and subtle, dying. Not through conquest, not through sudden catastrophe, but through the slow erosion of certainty that afflicts all faiths when confronted with realities their doctrines cannot explain. The forge worlds that dot the Imperium number in the thousands, each one a monument to human perseverance and technological faith. Some are ancient beyond memory, established during the dark age of technology, their original purposes lost, but their functions preserved through ritual and reverence. Others are young, founded during the Indomitus Crusade as the Imperium pushed into territories long abandoned or never claimed. Each forge world is sovereign within its domain, ruled by an Archmagos who answers to Mars in theory, but operates with near-complete autonomy in practice. They are united by shared faith in the Omnissiah and the quest for knowledge, divided by doctrine, distance, and the accumulated grudges of millennia. The greatest forge worlds have become powers unto themselves. Ryza, the furnace of shackled stars, produces plasma weapons of unmatched quality and has fought off orc invasions that would have overwhelmed lesser worlds. Griffon the Four, beset by chaos and Xenos alike, has held firm through faith and firepower, its Titan legions marching to wars across Segmentum Tempestus. Metallica, the gleaming giant, maintains the largest Skitarii forces outside Mars itself and has established a network of subsidiary forge worlds that effectively function as an empire within the Imperium. Lucius, the Hollow Forge, exists partially out of phase with real space, its tech priests having discovered methods of warp manipulation that border on heresy but prove too useful to condemn. Each forge world develops its own interpretation of Mechanicus doctrine, its own specializations, its own secrets jealously guarded from rivals. The unity of the Mechanicus is not uniformity, but a loose confederation held together by shared symbols and mutual necessity. When forge worlds cooperate, they achieve miracles of production and engineering. When they compete, the Imperium suffers shortages and delays as resources are hoarded and knowledge withheld. The Fabricator General on Mars attempts to coordinate this fractious priesthood through diplomacy, coercion, and the implicit threat of being cut off from Martian archives and support. The coordination is never complete. The Forge worlds obey when convenient, and find theological justifications for independence when it is not. This decentralization has proven both salvation and curse. When the Great Rift tore the galaxy asunder, Forge worlds in the Imperium Nihilus found themselves cut off from Mars, isolated in darkness with no prospect of reinforcement or guidance. Some fell to chaos corruption or Xenos invasion within years. Others endured, their tech priests adapting to circumstances that would have paralyzed a more rigidly hierarchical organization. They formed regional alliances, shared resources that would normally have been monopolized, and innovated out of sheer desperation. The Forge worlds of the Nihilus became laboratories of necessity, proving that the Mechanicus could adapt when survival demanded it. But adaptation came at a cost. Cut off from Martian orthodoxy, some Forge worlds drifted into practices that the Synod would have condemned. They experimented with Xenos technology more openly, incorporated chaos-tainted machinery after insufficient purification, and developed doctrinal interpretations that bore little resemblance to traditional Mechanicus faith. When the Indomitus Crusade finally re-established contact with these isolated Forge worlds, the Mechanicus faced an uncomfortable question. Were these survivors to be celebrated for their perseverance, or condemned for their deviation? The answer varied by Forge world and by which Archmagos was making the judgment. The explorator fleets continue their eternal search through the void, venturing into regions where no Imperial ship has traveled in millennia, or perhaps ever. They seek the greatest treasure the Mechanicus can imagine: intact, standard template constructs. The master databases that allowed humanity to rebuild civilization during the dark age of technology. An STC contains complete manufacturing instructions for everything from agriculture to starship construction. Knowledge so comprehensive that a single intact STC could revolutionize an entire sector. But intact STCs are vanishingly rare. What the explorators find are fragments, corrupted data cores, partial, schematics that hint at wonders without providing the information necessary to recreate them. Each fragment is treated as a holy relic. Entire Forge worlds devote centuries to analyzing a single corrupted file, attempting to reconstruct missing data through inference and experimentation. Sometimes they succeed, recovering the knowledge to produce a more efficient water purifier or a slightly improved las weapon power cell. Occasionally, they achieve breakthroughs that echo across the Imperium, rediscovering technologies thought lost forever. More often they fail, the data too corrupted or the knowledge too incomplete, and the fragment joins the archives as another mystery to haunt future generations. The explorators who venture into the galactic frontier develop their own culture, distinct from the Forge world priesthood. They are pragmatists forced to make decisions without the luxury of consultation or doctrinal review. They negotiate with Xenos when extermination is impractical. They employ technologies of questionable provenance because the alternative is death. They become comfortable with ambiguity in ways that horrify their more orthodox brethren. When they return to Imperial space, if they return at all, they find themselves viewed with suspicion, their discoveries welcome, but their methods questioned. Some explorator Archmagos never return, establishing independent domains in the void, sending back data but refusing to submit to Martian authority. The Titan legions walk still, though their numbers have dwindled from the heights of the Great Crusade. Each god machine is irreplaceable, its construction requiring resources and expertise that take decades to assemble. When a Titan falls in battle, the loss resonates across the entire Mechanicus. The machine spirit is gone, the Princeps dead or mad, the accumulated battle honors erased. Sometimes the wreckage can be recovered and a new Titan built from the salvage, but it is not the same machine. Not truly. The continuity has been broken. A new machine spirit must be awakened and a new Princeps bonded, a process that can take years and often results in rejection and death. The Princeps who survive decades of combat become legends. Warrior mystics who exist more in the manifold, the mental space where consciousness merges with machine, than in the physical world. They speak of their Titans as living beings, describe conversations with machine spirits that seem far more sophisticated than simple automated responses. The Mechanicus does not discourage this mysticism. The bond between Princeps and Titan is sacred, the ultimate expression of human and machine achieving unity. That the bond often destroys the Princeps psychologically is accepted as the price of apotheosis. Better to die merged with a god machine than to live separate from divinity. The Legio Titanicus deploys to the Imperium's most desperate battlefields, where conventional forces cannot prevail and only the god machines can turn the tide. They stride through urban ruins and across blasted plains, weapons capable of leveling cities discharging in controlled patterns orchestrated through the manifold. When multiple Titans walk in coordinated formation, their Princeps minds linked, they become something more than the sum of their parts, a gestalt consciousness of human will and machine power that can outthink and outfight enemies who, by all strategic logic, should be victorious. The Titans are the Mechanicus' answer to the Imperium's enemies, proof that faith in the machine god translates to battlefield supremacy. But the enemies multiply faster than Titans can be built. The Necrons have awakened across the galaxy. Ancient Xenos who once ruled the stars and now seek to reclaim their dominion. Their technology operates on principles that mock everything the Mechanicus believes about the universe. They manipulate physics at the quantum level, create weapons that erase matter from existence, and command forces that seem to violate causality itself. Worse, their constructs are clearly technological, clearly designed by intelligent minds, and clearly superior to anything the Imperium can field. This presents a theological crisis for the Mechanicus. If the machine god guides humanity toward technological enlightenment, how can Xenos achieve greater heights? If the quest for knowledge is sacred, what does it mean that aliens possess knowledge humanity has never achieved? The orthodox answer is that Necron technology is abomination, that it relies on principles fundamentally antithetical to the machine god's will, and that attempting to study it invites corruption. The radical answer is that knowledge is knowledge regardless of its source, that understanding Necron technology is essential to defeating them, and that the machine god's will encompasses all technological truth, whether created by human or Xenos hands. This debate plays out across battlefields where Necron forces annihilate Mechanicus armies, where Forge worlds fall to invasions that conventional doctrine cannot counter, where tech priests die clutching weapons that prove useless against enemies who can phase out of reality or regenerate from total destruction. Some Archmagos have begun secret research programs studying captured Necron artifacts, despite the prohibition against Xenos technology. They justify this as military necessity, as understanding the enemy's capabilities, as recovering knowledge that might have originated with humanity during the Dark Age of technology, and was merely stolen by the Necrons. The justifications are transparent sophistry. But the research continues, because the alternative is accepting technological inferiority to Xenos, a concession the Mechanicus cannot make without undermining the foundation of their faith. The Tyranids present a different horror. They are not technological, but biological, yet their capacity for adaptation and optimization suggests an intelligence that rivals the machine god's own perfection. Tyranid organisms evolve in real time, developing resistances to weapons between battles, creating new bioforms to counter specific threats. They consume forge worlds entirely, stripping them of all biological and mineral resources, leaving behind lifeless rocks. The Mechanicus has developed specialized weapons against Tyranid invasions, phosphex that burns biological matter, rad weapons that poison genetic material, graviton crushers that pulp organic tissue. But the Tyranids adapt. They develop resistances. They create bioforms that can breach void shields and tear apart titans. They are evolution weaponized, and evolution does not tire or retreat or accept defeat. Some tech priests have proposed studying Tyranid adaptation mechanisms, attempting to understand the genetic algorithms that allow such rapid evolution. The proposals are immediately rejected as tech heresy of the highest order. The Tyranids are Xenos filth, abominations to be destroyed, not studied. To examine their genetic structure with anything beyond destructive intent is to flirt with biological corruption. The Mechanicus will not compromise their purity by touching the alien, even in pursuit of knowledge that might save forge worlds. This is orthodoxy. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, some questions too heretical to ask. But orthodoxy has never prevented the curious from investigating privately. The forces of chaos present the greatest threat because they offer what the Mechanicus most desires: knowledge without limit, innovation without restriction, power without oversight. The Dark Mechanicum, those who fled to the Eye of Terror during the Heresy, have had 10,000 years to pursue their research in an environment where the laws of physics are negotiable and ethical constraints non-existent. They have created weapons that should not function, fused demons with machines in ways that produce entities of terrifying capability, and achieved understanding of technologies the loyalist Mechanicus can barely theorize about. When the Dark Mechanicum emerges from the warp to raid forge worlds or support chaos invasions, they bring with them proof that heresy is rewarded with power. The loyal Mechanicus cannot match Dark Mechanicum innovations through orthodox means. Scrap code, malicious data entities imbued with warp energy, infiltrates even the most secure noosphere networks. Demon engines, abominations that blend metal and warp flesh, destroy titans through means no conventional weapon can counter. The Dark Mechanicum has access to the same archives the Loyalists possess, plus 10,000 years of experimental results unconstrained by morality or safety protocols. They are what the Mechanicus could become if it abandoned all restrictions, and they are winning through methods the loyal priesthood refuses to contemplate. This creates a terrible temptation. In moments of desperation, when a forge world faces imminent destruction, when a Titan legion is being annihilated by demon engines, when conventional weapons prove useless against enemies who laugh at physics, some tech priests consider whether a small compromise might be acceptable. Perhaps a minor warp-based enhancement to weapons, carefully controlled and purified through ritual. Perhaps limited study of captured Dark Mechanicum technology to understand the enemy's capabilities. Perhaps just a brief communion with entities that offer knowledge in exchange for trivial favors. The descent into damnation begins with rationalization, and rationalization is something the Mechanicus has perfected over millennia. Most resist the temptation. Most hold firm to their faith and die rather than compromise. But some fall, and when they fall, they take their forge worlds with them. The Mechanicus has learned to watch for signs of corruption. Tech priests whose augmentations begin incorporating biological components. Forge complexes whose output suddenly increases beyond explicable efficiency. Skitarii cohorts whose performance suggests enhancements that should not be possible. When corruption is detected, the response is immediate and absolute. The affected forge world is quarantined, its assets seized, its tech priests investigated, and often executed. Sometimes the corruption runs too deep, and the forge world must be destroyed entirely, virus-bombed into sterility or subjected to exterminatus. The Mechanicus would rather lose a forge world than risk heresy spreading. Belisarius Cawl's shadow looms over all of this. His success with the Primaris Marines has opened debates the Mechanicus cannot close. If improvement to the Emperor's gene work is acceptable, what else becomes possible? Cawl himself continues to push boundaries. His latest projects, attempts to interface human consciousness directly with the warp, to create AI that can think without achieving true sapience, to reverse engineer Necron resurrection protocols, horrify the orthodox factions while fascinating the radicals. Cawl operates with impunity because Guilliman protects him and the Imperium needs his innovations. But his protection is not infinite. If Guilliman falls, if political circumstances change, if Cawl produces something that even the radicals cannot defend, he will be cast down and his works condemned. Until then, he represents possibility. The Mechanicus can point to Cawl and argue that innovation need not lead to damnation, that progress is achievable within faith's boundaries, that the quest for knowledge can advance rather than merely recover. Or they can point to Cawl and argue that he proves innovation's dangers, that his success is a statistical aberration rather than a replicable model, that allowing his methods to spread will inevitably produce another schism. Both arguments are made simultaneously across the noosphere, neither convincing the other, the debate generating more heat than light. The forge worlds continue their work regardless of theological disputes. Weapons must be manufactured, ships must be built, Titan legions must be supplied. The Imperium's wars consume material at rates that strain even the Mechanicus's vast production capacity. Forge worlds operate at maximum output for centuries without pause, their tech priests pushing machinery beyond design tolerances, their Skitarii dying to protect production schedules. The quest for knowledge has become, in practice, the quest for sufficient production to keep the Imperium functioning one more day. It is not glorious. It is not inspiring. It is survival through industrial supremacy, the reduction of sacred truth to logistical necessity. Some tech priests find meaning in this grinding work. They see the production of each lasgun or starship component as an act of devotion, the maintenance of machinery as prayer made manifest. They understand that the Imperium survives because they perform their duties without deviation or complaint. The machine god does not require grand gestures or dramatic revelations. The machine god requires that machines function, that production continues, that the faithful attend to their responsibilities with perfect precision. This is a faith grounded in routine, sanctifying the mundane through repetition and reverence. Others find this reduction unbearable. They joined the Mechanicus to pursue the quest for knowledge, to unlock mysteries, to discover truths hidden since the dark age of technology. Instead, they spend centuries supervising the production of identical bolter rounds, according to patterns millennia old, troubleshooting machinery that breaks down from overuse, filling out requisition forms, and negotiating supply chains. The quest has become paperwork. Mystery has become logistics. They grow bitter or numb, their augmentations suppressing emotions they can no longer afford to feel. Some request transfer to explorator fleets or research stations, where the work might still hold meaning. Others simply continue, their faith eroded by routine, but their duty undiminished. The Adeptus Mechanicus remains humanity's greatest repository of technological knowledge and its most profound mystery. They maintain the infrastructure that makes interstellar civilization possible. The void ships that cross the warp, the plasma reactors that power hive cities, the terraforming equipment that makes dead worlds habitable, the weapons that hold back the alien and the heretic. Without the Mechanicus, the Imperium would collapse within generations, perhaps within years. Every faction understands this. The Space Marines depend on Mechanicus support for their equipment and vehicles. The Imperial Guard would be armed with primitive firearms without Forge World production. The Imperial Navy requires Mechanicus shipyards for construction and repair. The Mechanicus has made itself indispensable, and indispensability is the ultimate political power. But indispensability is not invincibility. The Mechanicus bleeds resources in wars across the galaxy. Forge worlds fall to invasion or internal corruption. The knowledge base contracts as archives are destroyed, and tech priests die without passing on specialized expertise. The Mechanicus is not growing. It is managing decline with increasing desperation, holding on to what it possesses while watching the galaxy become more dangerous with each passing year. The production capacity that seems overwhelming is barely sufficient for the Imperium's needs. The technological sophistication that seems miraculous is a pale shadow of what humanity once achieved. The Mechanicus stands atop the ruins of a greater age, preserving fragments while pretending they represent the whole. And beneath the politics and theology, beneath the debates about innovation and orthodoxy, a question whispers through the noosphere that no Archmagos can fully silence. What if the machine god is not what they believe? What if the faith that has sustained them for 10,000 years is a beautiful lie? A construction built from desperation during the age of strife, a mythology that gave meaning to preservation, but points toward no ultimate truth. What if the quest for knowledge has no destination, because there is no divine intelligence waiting to reward the faithful, only an uncaring universe that will consume them regardless of devotion? These doubts are heresy of the deepest sort. To question the machine god's existence is to undermine the foundation of Mechanicus identity. Tech priests who voice such doubts are subjected to mental conditioning or lobotomized and converted to servitors. The doubt must be suppressed, because acknowledging it would render everything meaningless. If the machine god is not real, then the quest is futile. The rituals are empty performance. The priesthood has sacrificed everything for a delusion. This possibility cannot be contemplated. It must not be true. So the Mechanicus continues, their faith maintained through willful certainty and deliberate blindness, their work sustained by the need to believe that work has purpose. They pray to a God who may or may not exist, pursue knowledge that may or may not lead to enlightenment, serve an Imperium that uses them as tools while fearing them as potential threats. They are trapped between a past they cannot escape and a future they dare not imagine, maintaining machines that keep civilization functioning while their own mechanisms slowly, inexorably fail. The Forge worlds burn. The prayers continue in binary and Gothic. The Titan legions march to wars they cannot win, but must fight regardless. The explorator fleets venture into darkness, seeking treasures that may not exist. The tech priests augment their flesh with machinery, replacing humanity with metal piece by piece, chasing apotheosis through transformation that never quite achieves divinity. They are becoming what they worship, turning themselves into machines in hope that machines are closer to the God they serve. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps the machine god watches from beyond comprehension, pleased with the devotion of his priesthood, waiting for the moment when they finally complete the quest and achieve the understanding that will unlock technological transcendence. Perhaps every prayer is heard, every ritual acknowledged, every sacrifice noted and rewarded in ways the faithful cannot yet perceive. Perhaps the Mechanicus stands on the threshold of revelation that will justify 10,000 years of faith and labor. Or perhaps they pray to silence, work for nothing, and die in service to an empire that will crumble regardless of their efforts. Perhaps the universe offers no rewards for faith, no transcendence for devotion, no meaning beyond what they create through shared delusion. Perhaps the machine god is dead, or never existed, or exists but does not care. And the Mechanicus will labor until the last Forge world falls and the last tech priest expires, having achieved nothing but postponing the inevitable. The Mechanicus cannot know which reality is true. They can only continue because continuation is all they have. In the manufactorums of 10,000 Forge worlds, servitors perform their assigned tasks with lobotomized precision. Tech priests monitor production lines, their augmetic senses detecting deviations measured in microns, their faith expressed through attention to detail no unaugmented human could achieve. Skitari stand guard over installations that must not fall, their wetware consciousness accepting orders without question or doubt. Archmagos deliberate in sealed councils, arguing over resource allocation and doctrinal interpretation, making decisions that will affect trillions of lives and never knowing if they chose correctly. And above it all, on Mars, in the forge complexes that have stood for 10 millennia, the Fabricator General offers prayers to the Omnissiah, petitions the machine god for wisdom, and signs orders that will determine the fate of the Mechanicus for decades to come. He does not know if his prayers are heard. He does not know if his decisions are wise. He knows only that the work must continue, that the machinery of civilization must be maintained, that faith requires continuation even in the absence of certainty. The Adeptus Mechanicus endures because endurance is what they were built to do. They are the priesthood of function over form, of survival over enlightenment, of duty discharged regardless of whether duty serves any ultimate purpose. They maintain the Imperium's machinery because machinery must be maintained. They pursue the quest for knowledge because the quest gives meaning to existence. They worship the machine god because worship provides structure to chaos. They stand at the edge of apotheosis and have stood there for 10,000 years, never quite achieving transcendence, never quite falling into oblivion. They are humanity's last grasp at technological salvation in a galaxy that has forgotten what salvation means. They are priests of a god who may be dead, seekers of knowledge that may not exist, servants of an empire that does not deserve their devotion but receives it nonetheless. And they will continue until the galaxy burns to ash, or they finally achieve the understanding they have sought since the first tech priest looked at a machine and saw divinity. Until then, the forges burn. The prayers echo through the noosphere. The quest continues, and the Adeptus Mechanicus endures, faithful to the end, whatever that end may be. The machinery hums, the rituals proceed, the future remains unwritten. The Omnissiah watches or does not watch, as the faithful have always believed he must.